Life has a way of presenting perfect illustrations of God's Word. At least as pastors, we're kind of always looking for that. But thinking back to the weekend trip that Jill and I took last weekend over to visit family in California, my brother-in-law originally is from the country of Lebanon. And his mother, who lives there in the household, speaks very, very little English. So anytime we visited, it's always been a challenge to try to communicate with her. Very dear lady, grown to love her over the years, but really can't converse with her. So anyway, I got the bright idea of a wonderful tool that would help out this time around. And you may have heard of Google Translate, one of those nice techie tools that you can write or say something in one language, it'll translate it to another. So I had it all figured out. I thought, this is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to put the phrase in, "It's nice to see you again," in English, and it's going to perfectly translate it into Arabic. I thought, before I try it on her, I'll try it on my brother-in-law, who's very good in English and Arabic. And so I said, tell me if this works. And so this phrase, generally, "It's nice to see you again," he said, not exactly. He said it kind of sounded more like "it's a nice sofa" or something like that. But it didn't translate real well. And of course, as it turns out, there's a lot of Arabic dialects and languages and so forth. So what works in Lebanon may not work in Saudi Arabia and so forth. So anyway, I guess if I were to send a message to the good folks at Google, you need to work on your translator for Arabic. But how was I supposed to know that there's so many different variations of Arabic? I figure for a kid from Indiana, in rural Indiana, that's a lot to even figure this stuff out. So anyway, that didn't work as well as I thought. So that language issue was a real problem. And certainly I have a lot of issues with languages, like when we moved out here about 6 years ago almost. The problem I've had with the Hispanic language, not very good with it. How was I supposed to know that the L's are silent? So I don't know how many of you heard me say Ocotillo, until finally somebody, that's not how you pronounce it. You don't pronounce the L's. Or the G's that sound like H's. I kept saying Gila Bend. And I guess that's not right. I think it's Gila Bend. But I'm getting better at least I'm learning just not to say some things, because I know I'm going to badly mispronounce it. So anyway, my experience with languages is not great. English is challenging enough, but these other ones are a real problem. By the way, you probably didn't know this. Last week on February the 21st, it is International Mother Language Day. Did anybody here in this room know that? Mark that down. That's a very important date. February 21, it is International Mother Language Day. The purpose, I'm told, is to promote greater awareness of language and cultural heritage. Now you know. What I'm really surprised at is that the greeting card companies have not picked up on that. Wouldn't you expect, as much as they're trying to promote all the holidays, they would have picked up on that one. Well, anyway, they haven't yet, but don't be surprised in the near future if they do. Anyway, enough about that. Languages. How did we get so many languages? The book of Genesis that we have been studying answers that question, as well as so many other questions. That's what I'm liking about Genesis. It tells us a lot about why things are the way they are in the world today. Things like why we have weeds in our garden and in our yard. Genesis tells us why that is so. How about animals' names? Where did the names of animals come from? Genesis tells us that as well. Why do we wear clothes? Genesis tells us that too, and that's probably self-explanatory anyway. More sobering, of course, why do we die? We are told that also in Genesis. Why is there a rainbow in the sky with the sun shining through rain? Well, Genesis tells us that as well. But why are there so many languages? Look in Genesis 11, verse 1, because we're going to get into a story that you probably have heard many times. If you've sat in Sunday school class like I have, I've heard it a number of times. A very interesting story about the origin of languages. So Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. What an amazing world it was back then. They used the same language and they used the same words. There were no language barriers. No problems with Arabic or Hispanic or all those other languages. They all spoke one language. Literally it means one lip, one set of words. So they could communicate very well with one another. Now verse 2. It came about as they journeyed east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used bricks for stone, and they used tar for mortar. So again, all the peoples that spoke one language, the descendants of Noah, and I believe the story happens maybe at least 100 years after the time of Noah. Some of his descendants traveled to a particular area. In fact, if you were to back up into chapter 10, we're not going to go back and read it, but you'll learn about an interesting man by the name of Nimrod, interesting in a not a good way. Nimrod was a very wicked individual, but he founded the cities of Babylon and Nineveh. Verse 10 in particular of chapter 10 will tell you that. And so he is the one that established the city of Babylon, as we read here, on the plains of Shinar. A point of reference, modern-day Iraq. Iraq seems to always be in the news. Iraq, Afghanistan, all the Middle Eastern countries making the news today. What's old is new. Well, anyway, the plains of Shinar in modern-day Iraq is where the city of Babylon is established, according to this. Verses 3 and 4, I guess we already read verse 3. Verse 4, they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So these individuals get the bright idea. We should have a city, and we also ought to have a tower. I wonder, what is it about towers? There's a thing, that's a human thing. We like to build towers, and we like to build bigger towers all the time. I remember when the Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world. And so that was established as apparently a monument of American ingenuity. We built this tall building, and eventually there are others that are taller. There's the Sears Tower that was built, and of course we know about the World Trade Center and the whole story with that. And now over in some of the Asian and Middle Eastern countries, they're building even bigger towers, all competing to see who can build the tallest building. And so it's a human thing, I guess, that we like to build towers. And towers are not always a good thing. Certainly we learn that here. In fact, as a little side note, some of you are familiar with or read the book The Harbinger, which is kind of an interesting story regarding the destruction of the World Trade Center and some significance with that. I won't get into it, but you might want to read that. Very interesting. But here in Genesis 11, this original tower, the very first one ever built, they built it for a couple of reasons. They wanted to build a tower, it says, that would reach into heaven. And secondly, they wanted to make a name for themselves. So they wanted a tower that would reach into heaven. And this kind of brings a flashback to the 70s when I grew up to a song called Stairway to Heaven. Yeah, y'all heard it. They were kind of making a stairway to heaven of some sort. And so I'm reminded of that with this tower. And so they wanted to apparently try to reach God on their terms. That's what I make of the story. That's what they ultimately are trying to do. Trying to initiate contact with God in a way apparently that was very displeasing to Him. I mean, did they really believe they could build brick by brick a tower that would reach clear up to the dwelling place of God? Is that what it was all about? Because it seems like that is the case, and yet that seems absurd. For one thing, I noticed that they started building it on a plain, the plain of Shinar, as we just read. If you're going to build a tower, couldn't you save yourself a lot of trouble by going to a nearby mountain, at least starting there? So why did they start on a plain? What's that all about? Some speculate it wasn't about height. It was about astrology and some of those kinds of things that were not terribly pleasing to God. Astrology and sorcery, perhaps. So again, it's a matter of speculation. But they wanted to build a tower to reach into heaven. They wanted to make a name for themselves, we're told here. And then it says, if we don't do this, otherwise we're going to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. When I read that, doesn't it just kind of give a hint? You know what's going to happen next. That's exactly what God's going to do. We don't want to get, God's going to scatter them. So you kind of have an idea of what's coming next in the story. So verses 5 to 9, the rest of the story. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language." And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. A tower in a city called Babel, confusion, and of course the city of Babylon. And so that's why we have all the languages that we have. Because some people back a long time ago decided to do something God was not terribly happy with. They decided to build a city, they decided to build a tower that somehow God was displeased with. You know, that's the thing about Genesis. We don't get a lot of the reasons why. We just simply get the facts stated. What was it they were doing that was displeased? We don't know. But the fact remains, whatever was happening with the tower, God was not pleased with that. God said if people work together with one language, there's no end to the creative evil they're going to come up with. And so God confused the languages, and the abundance of languages today is a tribute, I guess, to God's judgment upon something that was not a terribly good idea. This is the ancient story of the Tower of Babel. And I'm thinking there's much of it that still comes down to us today. The spirit of Babylon, I believe, is still around today. And so I think there's something very relevant about this old story. For one thing, the phrase New World Order comes to mind as I think of it. Is there any one of us here who've not heard the phrase the New World Order? It is about oneness. It is about doing things cooperatively together, and it's not a good thing. And of course, we don't know a lot of the details because it's kind of one of those shadowy conspiracy type things. But it sounds like it's about a common government, a common currency, and trying to bring all the different languages and peoples together to do something that probably will not work out any better than the Tower of Babel did so very long ago. That spirit of Babylon is here today, and it will continue on into the future. If you have read Revelation chapter 17 and 18, it talks about Babylon. It talks about God's judgment, much like we read about here, a future judgment on some rebuilt type of Babylon, whether a literal city or something figurative. But God will be just as displeased with those efforts in the future as He was so very long ago. So that spirit of Babylon is around us. It is in our world. It is a part of the desires of humanity today. But I think down on a much more personal level, as I think about this tower, and I think about the ambitions of people then, I think there's some real personal lessons for us. I believe, first of all, that we can build our own misguided towers, in a sense, in our lives. The Tower of Babel that we just read about was an effort to try to reach God on their terms and in their way. And as I thought about that, I realized I could do the same thing in my life. So can you. We can try to do what they did so long ago. We can try to reach to God on our terms and in our way. And it never works. That's what religion is defined as. Religion is man's efforts to reach God. The Christian faith is God's efforts to reach down to man. And so efforts to try to reach out to God really can be very, very misguided. And so I thought about that in my own life. In what ways do I try to reach out to God on my terms and in my way? And I do that probably a lot more than I want to admit. I try to sometimes make God into my image instead of having it the other way around. In fact, sometimes, you might do this too, I approach God with a vending machine mentality. And I especially can think of that in terms of prayer. It's sort of like you put effort in, like a coin in the slot, and you expect God to dispense something according to what you want. And I think it's easy to look at Him that way. I mean, God can do all things. There's nothing God cannot do. So therefore, if I do just the right things, God will produce just what I want. That can be very misguided, just like this tower. So that can easily be one of my towers, my misguided towers, one of my efforts to try to reach God or try to make God on my terms in my way, and it will not work any better than it worked back at that time. In fact, if there's one thing we learn time and time again in Scripture, it is that God reaches out to people as He desires according to His sovereignty. Time and again, stories of unique ways that God appeared and manifested Himself and was reaching out to individuals, like burning bushes, for example, angelic appearances and audible voices, and the list could go on and on. God initiating contact. It works so much better when we do it that way. Instead of building our misguided tower saying, I want God now, I want God this way, instead, why not just be still and know that God is God? That just works a lot better. We want to be doing something. We want our time frame and our way, and so we can easily be presumptuous concerning God. Instead, it's a whole lot better to wait in silence, let God come and appear to us. And the older I get, the more I realize I need to do more waiting and less presuming. Kind of a spiritual experiment I've been on for a few months now. It's a simple thing, but it's working better for me. In the den in our house, I have a little leather end table. Footstool. Wrong word. Footstool. Got a little footstool that's up against the wall. And some time back, I realized I could make that sort of an altar where I just come, and when I'm there, I don't have to say a thing. I'm just there in God's presence to love Him and let Him love me, and to just enjoy and savor His presence in the silence. That has been a very enriching experience for me. Just the act of being there. We don't have to use words. And I'm refreshed in times that I do that. I try to do that on a regular basis in the morning, to just get down on my knees before that what do I want to say? End table. Not end table. Footstool. Help me with words here. Footstool. See, a week off and my language is really messed up. Footstool. To just be there and to savor His presence. It's really helping me out a great deal. So that's probably a good antidote to building those misguided towers to God that I'm easily able to do, and you as well. Another thing about Babylon and the tower, they said, let us make for ourselves a name. I had to step back and think about how often effort in my life, no doubt yours, is making a name for myself, for yourself. Much of life is, I want to do this, I want to achieve that. There is a desire that I think we all have for fame and greatness. If it was presented to us, we'd reach out and go for it. Given the opportunity, who wouldn't want their name recorded so that future generations would look back and say, here was a really outstanding individual. That's something very tempting and very alluring, to be famous. And yet I think the most famous person of all, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. I much more appreciate how Jesus could have reached out, made a name for Himself during His earthly ministry, knowing what He's going to get eventually anyway. But instead He gave us this amazing example to put Himself down as a servant. And there's the pattern for us. Do I want a name for myself? I have a human tendency that I do. I need to look at the pattern of Jesus, not the pattern of the builders of the Tower of Babel, but looking at Jesus to put myself down in service, to be willing to become nothing in order that God might do what He wants to do. Not my will, as Jesus prayed, but yours be done. I think to regularly pray that prayer helps us so that we get away from the curse of Babylon to make for ourselves a name. The legacy of languages, as we're talking about, is a reminder of the judgment of Babel so very many years ago. It is very reassuring to know that God has done something exactly opposite of that, really, in the times that we live in. The day of Pentecost, I'm reminded, we had a miracle of languages then and there. And it says in Acts chapter 2, verse 11, we hear them in our own tongues or languages speaking of the mighty deeds of God. What God did in displeasure at Babel, God has reversed in the age that we live in, the age of grace, that through His Spirit He broke through a language barrier and allowed people to be able to hear the mighty deeds of God through a great miracle of languages at that time. It is a reminder of what God is going to do in the perfect kingdom age. We will not be separated in any way, shape, or form. There will be no language barriers at that time. In fact, there is a prophecy in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, that is really reassuring in light of the story of Babel. It says, for then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord to serve Him with one accord. A very special prophecy in light of the story we read in Genesis. Imagine that. There will be that time with a pure language, with our words, with our hearts, with our minds. The time is coming when we will call upon the name of our Creator and God, and we will serve Him with one accord. No division, no separation whatsoever. One more hope and promise of the kingdom age to come. Amen.